Good evening to all of you. I'm really glad I have my colleague traveling with me. He reminds me to turn my microphone on because I like to keep it off and give you a double blessing so that you don't have to hear it. Thank you for coming. I don't know when I was here last, 5 years ago, 5 years ago maybe. Yeah, one of the pastors, Mario, is here who hosted me. But many, many years ago, for the first time, I came to South Africa. I was a guest of the famed Lo Alberts, your physicist, who taught, I think it was a Stellenbosch, not quite sure, but he hosted me in Cape Town along with Michael Cassidy and David Block. We covered 2 or 3 cities. That was probably when my hair was black. And as I say, then it turned gray and now it's turning loose. Somebody made a strange comment to me 2 days ago. He said, "Does wisdom come with gray hair?" I said, "If it does, I'm losing it." One after another, the strands are being given names personally because they are valued so much. But you wake up in the morning and do another funeral service for one strand that is gone. Nice to be with you. Thank you. You make me feel more welcome than you should, I suppose. But thank you for the kind applause and welcome. Almost wish that would end that way, but it doesn't always end that way. They say some people bring happiness whenever they go, and others bring wherever they go, and others bring happiness whenever they go. Here's the good news for that, and you'll have to pardon me, but we will be slipping out immediately after my talk. I hate to plan it this way, but I only get 2 days at home. And then I fly out again for other meetings in other parts of the country, and most of May is overseas as well. So I always take the first flight I can back home, and that's tonight. We'll be leaving from here. My colleagues and I are flying through Amsterdam back to Atlanta. In fact, my wife has just come off some minor surgery too, and I really do want to get back. She's doing well, and she never begrudges me being away. But I do want to be there, and I know you will understand. So we'll be heading out right after this talk, not because I want to flee. I would love to have stayed on and met some of you personally. Instead, we'll be airborne. Half my life I spend in the air, and when the flight attendants start recognizing you, you know you have paid your dues to the airlines. It's one of those things where I often wonder, when I was a young lad, my mother called an astrologer to read our palms, and they all believe in that kind of stuff there. Those of you who have your stock in an Indian heritage, you will understand that. So we were fairly young. 5 of us kids sat down in the front veranda, and the astrologer sat there. And actually, astrology was his avocation. He was actually a sari seller, but he also said he read palms. So my mother took him at his word, and he sat down and went from my older brother to me. And then as he was giving everybody their future, he looked at my palm and he went like this. He said, "Ravi Baba," which means Ravi little boy, "I have terrible news for you. You're not going to be traveling in life at all." And at that time, everybody in India wanted to go overseas. So he was really giving me bad news that I wasn't going to be traveling at all. I don't know what his profession is now. But I hope it is in weather reporting, because that's the only profession where you can be so wrong night after night and still be listened to so carefully the next night. So that was my early days of that so-called prophet. My mother was very disheartened. Thankfully, it turned out to be wrong. Now, we travel so much, and we do it for the sake of the gospel. We don't do it because it's a fun thing to do. That wears off very quickly after a first year or two living out of a suitcase. But you have one of the most beautiful countries in the world. I've always enjoyed coming, especially going to Cape Point. I've called it the Taj Mahal of the wild blue yonder. It's just beautiful to see it, and I hope we'll have the opportunity to return again. Some years ago, I was reading an airline magazine, and every now and then you can run into some pretty good articles in there. And one of these was on ethics. So I decided it'd be interesting to read it. And the opening illustration was this, so you'll have to pardon me for it. It's about this man sitting next to an attractive young woman on a flight, and he finally propositioned her for $1 million. She looked at him rather stunned, and he said, "One night, 1 million." And she sort of brushed him off. But a few minutes went by, she said, "Are you serious? One night, 1 million?" He said, "Yeah." She said, "All right, give me your name, your telephone number, the name and place, and we'll find a spot." So he did all of that. 10 minutes before they landed, he looked at her and said, "I have to tell you the truth. I really don't have $1 million, but I do have $10. Would you be willing to settle for $10? At which point she looked at him and said, "What do you think I am?" He said, "That we have already established. We're just haggling over the price." When I read that, I didn't know who I disliked more out of the two. It left you sort of numbed. But he was introducing an idea that as far as ethics goes, and values go, and goodness goes, everybody has a price. If you meet that price, they will compromise and they will sell whatever those convictions are worth, if the price is right. So after reading that, I started to ponder the question. I said, is that true? Is it true that every one of us has a price, that we will sell our deepest convictions or our deepest affections or our deepest attachments if the price is right? And I disagreed with that conclusion, because I can guarantee you, almost every one of you sitting here, there are some things you will never sell, no matter what the price is. And I know 2 or 3 things will immediately come to your mind. The biggest things in the world can be offered to you, but the things that you hold dearest and that you treasure, which makes you you deep in your soul, there is no price that'll buy or trade away that conviction for you. You know, the enemy of our souls believes this stuff, that there is a price, and if you pay the right price, every man or woman will ultimately compromise. And sadly, politicians have been poor examples in this. The price has been right for some of them, and many times the welfare of the people is sold. Sometimes it happens in the ministry. At other times it happens in a court of law. All kinds of values are sold for personal gain. And I find this passage that I'm going to read to you really fascinating. It comes to us from the 4th chapter of the book of Matthew. And I've called this absolute truth in relative terms. Absolute truth in relative terms. This is a setting in which Jesus was by himself. There is no eyewitness. Nobody is watching what is going on. So truly, it is a case of one-on-one, the very Son of God against the prince of the power of the air, who had steered him into that setting, caught him at the right moment as far as the adversary was concerned, in a desert when he was hungry and desperately longing for some physical sustenance. It's a fascinating series of temptations. If you understand what's going on here, you will understand that in some way, all of us meet these very temptations, because it starts off with materialism and ultimately moves to the threat of your spirituality. Matthew chapter 4. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, "If you're the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus answered him, "It is also written, Do not put the Lord your God to the test. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give you, he said, if you will bow down and worship me. Jesus said to him, Away from me, Satan, for it is written, Worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Then the devil left him, and angels came and attended him. One of the other gospel writers says that the devil left him only for a season. He was going to return. And we see that return very specifically just prior to the cross, the very purpose for which Jesus had come. And so as I read this passage, I look at it and I say, just study very carefully what it is that's really going on here. Because the enemy of our souls is shrewd. He's sharp. He doesn't lack any skill here in how to try and trip us up. He will use any scheme and any method. Sometimes when your body is fatigued, you will find your thinking is not that clear. At other times when you're surrounded with just all kinds of things closing in on your economic security or your emotional security, whatever it is that you've been banking on is now being lost, and the devil will come to you from that angle. He knows exactly where the vulnerable points are. He understands your heart and my heart extremely well. We often picture him as coming sort of in a red suit with horns on his head. Not so. He comes and appeals to you in ways where he knows what it is you're exactly looking for and can be seduced and deceiving you into believing that that's where you're really going to find it. So the first thing he comes to him is from the intellectual viewpoint. And he says, if you turn these stones into bread, people will follow you. You know, it's a very logical sequence for him. Why do you think people are not believing in you? Because you're not really giving them all the comforts that they need. If they have the bread that they need, if they have the comfort that they need, if they had all of this, they will fall down on their feet and worship you. I find it fascinating that one of the wealthiest countries in the world, the United States, in contrast to some parts of my upbringing, at least in India, where poverty is so rife and so real, India is the most religious country in the world. America is fast becoming one of the most secularized countries in the world. At Harvard University, the highest number of students in percentage for the first time registered themselves as having no belief in God whatsoever. They are in the category called the nones, or in many ways, really either agnostic or atheistic. So the farther along we have moved with comfort and education and success and power, less and less people seem to really believe that there is a God who is in control of all of this. Abraham Lincoln said, the day will come where you will think you have accumulated all these things by your own wisdom and by your own prowess. He said, that'll be the dangerous day when this country will lose the very reason and the very core of its being. Jesus looks at him and says, Begone, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. Jesus doesn't only state the negative here, he also states the positive. Let me take the negative for the first instance and say to you why it is we cannot live by bread alone. Physically we may, but the inner man, the inner being that we are, has something far greater than just material goods. I want to give you two illustrations that will sustain this, one personal and one in many ways geopolitical. One of my favorite authors, people ask me, who are the authors who've really influenced you? I would say one of the earliest ones was the British journalist Malcolm Muggeridge. And the reason Muggeridge influenced me was not just in his ability to unpack some very real themes, but the way he became a master of words and language so that with poignancy he would use a precise word in which to open up an idea and stir your imagination. He once made the comment that when he stands before God, he was going to have to ask for forgiveness for being so fatally fluent. I think there was something to that. He was a master of words and language. But he was editor of Punch magazine. Muggeridge loved India. He spent many years in India. India was one of his favorite stops. He knew the big names like Gandhi and Nehru and all of them, and was oftentimes entertained by them. But Muggeridge was an indulgent, sensually driven man. Everything for him was open game in terms of humor. Some of the most profane things often came from his pen. But one day he says he got out of his room where he was teaching in the south of India, teaching journalism. It was at dawn. And he went over to the river to have his bath. As he was about to get into the river to swim, he looked way out into the distance, and the sun had just risen, the light still somewhat golden. But he saw the silhouetted figure of a woman way out in the distance, also entering the waters, and he was quite sure she was unclad. Muggeridge's mind began to twirl, and all kinds of ideas came into his mind. He started to swim in her direction. And in his own version of it, in his first volume of his autobiography, The Green Stick, A Chronicle of Wasted Years, he says, as he was swimming towards her, something within him kept saying, don't do this, don't do this. But he swam harder and harder till he approached her. And as he came literally within touching distance of her, he put his head out of the water to shake off the water to get a good glimpse at this Indian woman who had just come into the waters herself. He saw a woman covering herself like that, shocked that somebody was so close to her with total disregard for her privacy. But then what shocked him was even greater. He realized he was looking into the face of a woman with leprosy. He saw the fingers were eroded, the nostrils were not there, the lips were not there, and he just nearly was sick to his stomach as he saw her. And he made some glib comment about how hideous and how ugly her body and her countenance were. As soon as he finished saying how hideous this woman was, he turned to swim away, and he said, I paused to realize it was not her who was hideous, but my heart and the inclinations of my passions and how far they had actually taken me. I was living with the wretchedness of this heart. Fast forward many, many years later, in 1960, there was a cloak and dagger operation set up by a man called Peter Malkin with the Israeli Mossad. And he had tracked down Adolf Eichmann in Argentina. They would hide way out in the bushes, and through high-tech equipment would see this very slender man get out from a bus at the same time every day, leave at the same time every morning with a briefcase in his hand. He would come into his living quarters. He had a gate that he would unlock. Before he went into his home, he would always turn around and look to make sure nobody was watching. And then as he would open the door, a little boy would come and leap into his arms. They monitored this day in and day out. Till one morning, as he was leaving for work in the morning, Peter Malkin, with some of his colleagues out there, had a syringe ready in hand, jabbed it into his upper arm, instantly knocked him out, and in an incredible way smuggled him out of Argentina back to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem for the trial. The story is told in a book called The House on Garibaldi Street. When they got him there, Malkin was determined to honor what he was told, not to question this man. So he didn't do it on their last train journey. But just before they got off, he couldn't resist one question. So he went into the compartment where Eichmann was, all bandaged up and unable to move because of the way he was medicated and so on. But he waited till he regained a little bit of his clarity, and he looked at him and he said, Mr. Eichmann, I used to see a little boy coming and leaping into your arms. Who was that? Eichmann said, that's my son Ricardo. He said, how old is he? He said he was about 4 or 5. He said, you know, Mr. Eichmann, I haven't had a nephew that age, and you killed him. Under your orders, my nephew was killed. Can you tell me what's the difference between Peter Malkin told Eichmann that my nephew was killed by you? He said, can you tell me what's the difference between my 4 or 5-year-old nephew and your son? Eichmann just put his head back and thought and thought and thought, and he looked at Peter Malkin and said, "My son is not Jewish." As soon as Eichmann said that, Malkin wished he had never engaged him in that conversation. He went into his private quarters, even the movie recounts it. He put his face in his hands and sobbed his heart out, unable to explain what this hatred was from this man whom he had never met, all because of his ethnicity and his race. And you know, Hannah Arendt wrote a book on the trial and execution of Adolf Eichmann. Her last paragraph is worth the book. Many scholars have questioned whether she got all the facts right or not. But Hannah Arendt ended by saying this was a closing of a gruesome chapter revealing the banality of evil, the trivialization of evil. Get a note of that phrase. This comes from an existentialist author talking about a Nazi man and a Jewish person in interaction, the trivialization of evil. What does that mean? That can only mean that the fangs of evil are so real and so destructive that if you trivialize it and you minimize it, you've actually called for the slaughter of people in the masses and the numbers and in the millions. Evil is a real force in our world. Evil goes beyond sin. Sin is what Muggeridge saw in himself, that he was violating his own conscience and violating the inner law of respecting the body of another person, and not that it was inviolable. You cannot plunder another person's body like that. He saw the sin in his heart. Evil goes beyond that. It goes beyond the individual effect to the destruction of others. That's where evil really goes. That's why I want you to understand when we use these terms interchangeably, they're all ultimately based on the fact that there is a transcendent moral law that God has given to us. And when you take the 10 Commandments, it can all be reduced to basically one phrase: the sacredness of life, the sacredness of your word, the sacredness of your marriage, the sacredness of your property, the sacredness of your relationships, the sacredness of what you own and how you tithe and how you give. And when you make evil trivial, you don't only violate what is in your heart, you ultimately violate other people as well. Jesus could very easily have turned that stone into bread. In fact, there were times where he took just the lunch of a little boy and fed thousands at the same time. He could have done it. He could very easily have done it, but he didn't buy into the seductive lie of relativizing the absolute that Satan had given to him. A text without a context becomes a pretext. And Jesus said to him, that man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So the alternative here that Jesus is giving is not just telling you that you don't live by bread alone, but that the word that he has given to you and me, the propositional truth that he's revealed to you and me, in them there is life. That's the reality that describes who you are, how you think, why we are here, and why God had given to us his written word. This is something that, philosophers don't easily like to understand, but or even deal with. But the scriptures in Romans 1 give us the trajectory. It moves from rejection to alienation to domination to condemnation. Rejection of God's law to alienation from God to domination of that evil passion in your heart and ultimately to condemnation. That is the four-sequence thing that sets into your life and mine. You reject his law. You get alienated from God, and then you get dominated by living for self, till ultimately you bear the condemnation of a law that you and I had violated. This realization is a hard thing to come by because it ultimately is seen as a humiliation of the human being. It is not. It is a humbling of the human being. not a humiliation of it. And if you do not have a humble heart, pride will ultimately destroy you and bring you down to humiliation. God alone knows how to humble us without humiliating us and to exalt us without flattering us. Those are the words of the famed English writer E.M. Blakelock, who says, God alone knows how to humble you without humiliating you, or to exalt you without flattering you. The first time I realized how wretched my own heart was, and I'd not really gone the way that I was raised in a very sheltered upbringing. We never crossed certain boundaries, more out of the fact that we were dead scared of our father to do anything else. And so growing up in India till I was 20, I don't recall crossing any line that today people talk about so much. But it's not because I was such a righteous guy, just that I was afraid of falling into the hands of my dad. And so it was. But at age 17, on a bed of suicide, when the Bible was brought to me, and I realized how helpless I was, how lowly I had come, that not only had I not known how to live, I didn't even know how to die. Satan's temptation was for materialism. Live with bread, live for matter, live for everything that is substantive, and you will find happiness. Jack Higgins, who wrote the famous book, The Eagle Has Landed, was being interviewed some years ago, and he was asked this fascinating question: what is it that you now know that you'd wished you'd known as a younger man? He said, what I now know that I'd wished I'd known as a younger man is that when you get to the top, there's nothing there. When you get to the top, there's nothing there. The loneliest moment in life is when you have experienced what you thought would deliver the ultimate, and it has let you down. Some of the most distraught people I have met are those who have attained the pinnacle of success. Some years ago, I used to do a lot of chapel studies with the Atlanta Braves. My friend was the chaplain at that time there, and so he'd invite me in. When you come to the MLB, the Major League Baseball players, most of the teams have chaplains. And before the game is played, the visiting team is invited to come and listen to the guest speaker. It's only about a 10, 12-minute talk. And then the home team listens to you. And then they go out and have a great time beating up each other. But here they are, they're listening to you. And I spoke to them on the problem of pleasure. I began my talk by saying, I watched you boys coming in. You got muscles like watermelons. I said, me walking in here is the only fellow that fails the physical. I said, you guys can hurl a ball at a speed that I wouldn't even known that it's been thrown. I can't beat you at baseball. You're pros. I said, but I'll tell you what I've done more than probably most of you have. I have lived out of a suitcase and lived away from home more than half my life. I want to talk to you about how to live away from home. Those boys leaned forward and started listening. One of their biggest paid sluggers, handsome guy making a multi-million-dollar contract. The player stood up to walk away, and he came over towards me and put his hand behind my neck like that. He said, I need to talk to you. And my travel associate, sensing that this was something so personal, moved away. And he looked at me and he said, Ravi, I have more money than I ever thought I would, but I have less things of value than I've ever had. I have more money than I ever thought I would, but less things of value than I ever had. To you young men, don't chase pleasure. Don't chase pleasure. You'll be trying to catch up with a shadow that you will never catch up to. And in fact, I can guarantee you it will let you down. You are not ultimately matter. You are made for spiritual fulfillment. And so Jesus says, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. The temptation to the intellect was dismissed away with materialistic flaws. So then the enemy moved to the second area. He moved to the will. What did he say? He said, look, why don't you jump? He's promised to take care of you. Why don't you jump and see if he will honor what he has promised you? This is the temptation to the will. This is utilitarianism. using God for your purposes. So the first one was the temptation to materialism. Second one, the temptation to utilitarianism, not in the strictest sense that you would have the Bentham and Mill version of utilitarianism, but I'm talking here about the version of using God, utilizing Him for your own purposes. And Jesus gave him a remarkable response and said, no, you shall not tempt or test the Lord your God. What he's really saying is, you don't understand how God works. If you're coming to God to use Him for your purposes, you're really not coming to God. You have become the God of God. That's what Alexander Pope said. We've snatched from His hand the balance and the rod. We have rejudged His justice. We've become the God of God. We tell God when to deliver. We tell God when to do and what to do. We use Him like a slot machine and say, now you deliver. Today it's a hurting leg. Tomorrow it's a hurting family member. Another day it's a hurting finances. You better deliver. And He says, no, you shall not test the Lord your God. Jesus puts the reality of a relationship with God in clear perspective. You follow Him for who He is, not what it is that He can do for you. You follow Him for who He is and not what it is that He can do for you. 11 out of the 12 disciples died a martyr's death. You know, it is fascinating what is going on here, and I want to focus on this for a few moments now, folks. What is going on here is that if Jesus had given in to this temptation, He would have violated the purpose for which He had come. The purpose for which He had come was the centrality of the cross of Jesus Christ. That's why Satan returns again before, getting Him to struggle in the flesh, if there be any other way. But Jesus won that round and said, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And then the thief on the cross, if thou be the Christ, save thyself and us. Interesting, Jesus didn't have to respond to him. The other thief did. He said, don't you fear God? He's done nothing amiss, but you and I receive the due reward of our deeds. And he commits in a prayer to Jesus, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. That thief saw the difference of the economic theory of the two kingdoms. This momentary loss, this momentary pain was nothing compared to the ultimate purposes of God, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of God. What is so critical about the cross? What is so unique about the cross? You don't see it in any other worldview. In fact, if you were to talk to a very devout Muslim, he or she will tell you they cannot fathom the cross. They don't understand it. How can God be so humiliated before His own creation? And even they go so far as to say He didn't actually die on the cross. They are the only ones of all of the historians in the world who deny that Jesus was even crucified. The Jewish historians tell us that, the pagan historians tell us that, the Greek historians tell us that, the Roman historians tell us that, but for them it just seemed incalculable that how could a mighty God do something like that to His own Son. You know, there's a story told of a little guy who was sitting in a bus years ago in the United States. And there's a big African-American man who was sitting next to him. This little guy gave him a little hip shrug. So the big guy moved. Gave him another hip shrug. The big guy moved. He kept doing this till the bus stop came for the big guy, and he put his hand into his pocket and took out a card and gave it to the little fella. Joe Louis, world heavyweight boxing champion, who had enough strength in his fist to hit through the side of a bull. Here's the pipsqueak of a guy shoving him around. Who showed greater strength? Who showed greater strength? I was talking to a sheikh in Ramallah. Some of you may have heard me tell this story. It was one of the most moving moments in a conversation that was intensely so problematic to even try to say what you wanted to say. But he was fists flailing. He'd spent so many years in prison. He was angry with all of that was going on. And at one point, the Archbishop looked at the five of us and asked us to ask him a question each. We'd already been there a protracted period of time. I asked my question, and I didn't like his answer. I asked my question, and I didn't like his answer. And I told him that. I said, Sheikh, you and I may never meet each other again. But we are sitting here in Ramallah, and I'm the guest of the Archbishop of Canterbury. He's asked me to come with him. But I do want to say to you this. Not far from here is a hill. 5,000 years ago, a man by the name of Abraham took his son up that hill in order to offer him as a sacrifice to show his faith in God. Do you remember that story? He said, yes. I said, please, let's not discuss which son. Let's just agree he took his son up that hill. He nodded his head. I said, but as the axe is about to come down, what does God do? Stops the arm of Abraham. He says, stop. I said, what does God say? Abraham said, God told him that God himself would provide. So he takes the son back. I said, Sheikh, 2,000 years ago, God kept that promise very close to where you and I are sitting. God took his own son up a hill called Calvary. And this time the axe did not stop. I said, Sheikh, until you and I receive the son that God has provided for us, we'll be offering our own sons and daughters on the battlefields of this world for position and power and land and prestige. He just stared at me. The Archbishop said, I think it's time to go. As we went down the steps, the Archbishop, being the guest of honor, was ushered in by the Sheikh and the bodyguard out there. And us five of us boys were walking over to another SUV. And I heard running behind me, and I turned around just this way, and it was the Sheikh. And before I could turn around completely, he twirled me around. He's a strong guy. I have 2 titanium rods holding me up. And he just looked at me and he said, Mr. Zacharias? I said, yes, sir. And he kissed me on both sides of the face. His lips quivered. His eyes grew moist. He said, you're a good man. You're a good man. I hope someday I see you again, sir. And I gave him a big hug. You see, there's only one place in the world where our quest for absolutes converge. Evil, justice, love, forgiveness. They converged on a hill called Calvary. Evil, justice, love, forgiveness. And the Father told us what is the greatest truth that underlies this world. There has to be justice. There's the reality of evil, but the conquering power of love and forgiveness will have the final word in reality. And she says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. Do you realize only in the Christian faith do you have the combination of grace and truth and the absoluteness of love incarnated and revealed in the very Son of God? There's no other faith where you can go to see the value that is placed upon you, where God says to you, He has loved you with an everlasting love. We take it for granted, but we need to pause every day and thank Him for the love that He has for us and the provision that He makes for us. I have a little grandson called Jude. He's 6 years old now. But when he was somewhere between 3 and 4, he's a boy with an incredible vocabulary. He can talk to you on many things that'll stun you. And one day when his mother, Naomi, my daughter, had lost her car keys, she slapped her forehead and finally said, I must be losing my mind. And this wee little guy comes right in front of her and he says, Mommy, whatever you do, don't ever lose your heart because I'm in there. Don't ever lose your heart because I am in there. What language shall I borrow to thank you, dearest friend, for this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end? O make me thine forever, and should I fainting be, Lord, let me never, never outlive my love for thee. I sometimes think about the cross and shut my eyes and try to see the cruel nails and crown of thorns and Jesus crucified for me. But even could I see him die, I would but see a little part of that great love which like a fire is always burning in his heart. The incredible truth of God's sacred love. I have loved you with an everlasting love. Do you know, the Apostle Paul couldn't fathom this. He was guarding the clothes of the people that were stoning Stephen to death. Little did he dream that he was going to be the next one to succeed Stephen and take the gospel to the whole world. He came to Christ differently to any of the other disciples. They all came to Christ, birth, life, death, resurrection. He came in the reverse. He saw the resurrection, and that's why he said, that I may know him, the power of his resurrection, and the fellowship of his suffering, being made conformable unto his death. He fathomed the resurrection. He could not understand the cross. He made it his entire life pursuit to try and understand the cross. Henceforth, let no man trouble me, because I bear on my body the marks of the Lord. I desire to know nothing amongst men save Jesus Christ and him crucified. To him it became the centerpiece and the cornerstone, that the cross of Jesus Christ is what he took to the globe, to the world, and the entire Western world got the message from him, and then on through St. Augustine and so on and so forth. He wrote for us 1/3 of the New Testament. I say to you, the more people see the love of God in you, the more they will understand the cross. The less they see the love of God in you, the less they will understand the cross. Because that is the imperative. And he says to him, begone, you shall not test the Lord your God. Cursed it, we have made evil to be attractive and full of charm, and good to be boring and flat. We've reversed the poles, like reversing the pole of an electric current. And you know the consequences of that. The imagination is a sacred chamber of your life and mine. That's where, may I suggest to you, if you're raising children, don't let the media of entertainment train their imagination. Let the God-given imagination be trained by good reading, which gives them the sovereignty of their own imagination, rather than circumscribing it through the imagination of somebody else. Teach them to read, not just to see. Jesus did not say in the beginning was video. We would think he did. He said, in the beginning was the Word. Truth is primarily a property of propositions. Thy word is truth. Thy word abides forever. The scriptures cannot be broken. Thy word have I hid in my heart, that I might not sin against thee. The imagination is the sacred chamber, and if you plunder it, every time you see something very similar, the rewind button goes into play and brings back that imagination that was assaulted before, and you want that rush and that fix again. Teach your imagination to delight in the beautiful, in the true, in the good. And when your imagination is given that kind of beauty that it revels in, then you see some of the greatest writers are the poets who can take you on a walk along the meadow or along a lane or in a botanical garden and lift you to the highest heavens in just seeing a beautiful rose. Out of the lips of babes you have ordained praise. Take a baby in your arms and see something spectacular, something so splendid. You know, my daughter Naomi sent me a little video yesterday of myself singing to my grandson Jude when he was 3. I will not do that for you. But I was singing to him a Hindi song. And he was sitting at the table, and I've got it on my BlackBerry here now, and I watched it, and the whole family chipped in and said, wow, Dad, he's got his eyes just glued on you as you're singing, just staring at me like that. Sing it again, Papa. He had no idea what I was saying. I was singing in Hindi, but he was watching his dad and listening to his dad singing something, and those wide eyes and the light reflecting off it of this little boy just staring, and you see the heavens reflected in the life of a little child. God's made this world beautiful. We have made it an ugly world, and that's why the heartache and the sorrow. And so it comes to this third reality. He says, I will give you all the kingdoms of this world if you will bow down and worship me. That's the deal, folks. That's the price. That's the price he wants. Here's the $1 million. He's not telling you he's backing off. He's in the plane of life with you. I'll give you all of this, not just for a night, for a day, for the rest of your life. All I want from you is bow down and worship me. How many have done that calculatedly and walked away and said, it wasn't there? A man who took his life in Las Vegas left a note on his night table. Here, there are no answers. What is God saying to you? What then does he want from you? You know, our festival of thought is focused on origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. I just want to take this one thought on meaning. And by the way, it's so wonderful to have my colleagues here. I meant to introduce them earlier, and especially good to see you, Winston Malatse. He's our director in Africa. Get behind this man. He's a wonderful apologist, and has his team put all of this together here. But the idea of meaning that you look for, that I look for, it's not just a case of translation. It's a case of what is the glue that holds your life together? What is that fundamental imperative that motivates everything else? What is the one reality that pulls together all other realities? The Greeks searched and searched and searched and never found the answer. They looked for one answer that they desperately longed for, finding unity in diversity. That's why they started the universities. To find unity in diversity. Ask an average university student today if he or she has found unity in diversity. They come from pluriversity today. Nothing is fitting together. Nothing is coming together. In fact, some of the universities of the world are the most restless spots on the face of the earth, because they've lost the queen of the disciplines. No, it's not science. No, it's not mathematics. No, it's not religion. It is the reality of God himself, the theos and the logos. That's why we ultimately called it theology. Religion alone won't do it for you. Religion may be a path that you enter into. The queen of the disciplines is understanding the message of God as he revealed it in his Son, Jesus Christ, and offers to indwell within you through the Holy Spirit. Religion is the path of looking for God. The Christian faith is the path of God looking for you. I fled him down the nights and days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinthine ways of my mind, and in the midst of tears I hid from him. Adown titanic glooms I sped, adown amidst running laughter from those strong feet that followed after. Ah, poorest, blindest, meekest, I am he whom thou seekest. Thou dravest love from thee that dravest me. He's pursuing you. He's following you, and he says, I am come that you might have life. The Greeks never found unity and diversity because the Greeks, all goodness was abstraction and theory. It took the Hebrews to remind us that the great I am is the one in whom all goodness is rooted. You will never find unity and diversity on the outside until you find unity and diversity on the inside. And that unity comes from honoring God, that gives you a love for the diversity around you, and that instructs what is good and what is true. That's where you will find unity. As I see in your face and see in your countenance the very image of God, it's because he transforms my heart and he transforms yours. worship. So let me close. How do you find this? Archbishop William Temple defined worship in these words. Worship is the submission of all of our nature to God. It's the quickening of conscience by His holiness, nourishment of mind by His truth, purifying of imagination by His beauty, opening of the heart to His love, and submission of will to His purpose. All this gathered up in adoration is the greatest expression of which we are capable. Quickening of conscience by His holiness, nourishment of mind by His truth, purifying of imagination by His beauty, opening of the heart to His love, and submission of will to His purpose. All this gathered up in adoration is the greatest expression of which you are capable. No pleasure in the world will ever give you that. Only at His right hand are pleasures forevermore. We have a teammate with us, comes from Australia. His name is David Bennett. One of his books is about to be released. It's called The War of Loves. David tells his story of what he has struggled with all his life. He's an amazing man. My colleagues know him. He's a lovable guy. When he walks into the room, he brings electricity into the room. But you know what? He said while he was running on the wrong track and running in the different direction and pursuing all kinds of amorous relationships, he said one day, sitting in his room, as he had finished reading another book, and he wept and wept and wept and cried out to God. He said, the presence of God filled me from head to toe, and I knew right then no experience in this world could ever match that. No experience in this world could ever match that. You know, about a couple of years ago, I was in Sydney, and I met his father and mother who just came to say thank you, although his dad was still struggling with the faith. I saw David 2 weeks ago in Oxford. He said, I want to let you know my dad has come to know the Lord. It's amazing. When we were in Cape Town last week, one of my colleagues, Tanya Walker, I've known Tanya. Her maiden name is Yegnazar. She's an Iranian gal, done her PhD in Sharia. I've known her from when she was 7. She said, Uncle Ravi, I had the most exciting experience this afternoon. I was invited to speak to young people. They were all believers, except one. And they'd all been praying for her for 1 or 2 years. And she showed up at the meeting. And at the end of the meeting, she came up to me and she said, can we talk? She said before that conversation was over, she gave her life to Jesus Christ. One more for the kingdom. One more for the kingdom. And so I leave this with you. The temptation to the intellect, the temptation to the will, and the temptation to the imagination. Be gone, it is written. Be gone, it is written. The Word gives you the prescription to meet all of your intellectual needs in legitimate ways. Tells you how to be harnessing your will and how to train the imagination. It is because of what happened in this 4th chapter that we have Calvary, and through Calvary we have the empty tomb, and today we have the gospel of Jesus Christ for the whole world that is able to transform every man and woman and child. If you don't know Him, I pray today you will truly seek after Him. He will fill you with the greatest of joy and the greatest of love that you have ever experienced. Thank you, and God bless you. Okay.
We would like to have an opportunity for people that would want to ask questions. As we said earlier, if you have a question that you would like to ask and have answered, if you can come to the front here on my right, and the guys will help you there, and we will gladly facilitate the time of questions and answers. So quickly, if you can make your way to the front to get a question. We've got our first question. I'm going to allow the question to be asked. Thank you.
Hi, hello. Sit on.
And please speak clearly. I'm now 72 and all of my faculties are leaving me.
Hi, Ravi. Thanks for the talk. It was great. I'm involved with the student ministry, so this is where the question comes from. As you travel through South Africa, you'll see there's a lot of inequality in the country. Many people are suffering, and through no fault of their own. One of the hot topics in our society is colonization and the effect that it's had on South Africa. And one of the questions that comes up, there's a number of young people that are leaving the Christian faith because they've seen a connection between colonization and the Christian God. And a question that gets asked to me, which I want to put to you, is if the Christian God exists, does he love some people more than others?
And as you're speaking, there's a different colonization taking place out there. It'll take eternity to get to all of those. That's what you call people of faith, right at the back there. I appreciate the question very much. Where are you? You're seated right there. First of all, it'd be very presumptuous for me to walk into a setting like this where the issues are so deep and the matters are so painful and the memories are so raw and the reality is so undebatable. It's happened. For me to even pontificate any kind of answer would be seen very a meager attempt. But the way you have asked the question makes it easier for me to answer it. And your question is, many of them see that the Christian faith was behind all of this, and so they have tossed it out in their own process. Is there an answer in the very love of God that they did not see expressed? In many ways, India experienced the same thing, but not to the degree here. And till this day, unfortunately, with the division of India and Pakistan, there are animosities that are so deep and so real that we used to be brothers in many ways, Indians and Pakistanis, but now we have parted, and they were given territory on the basis of their faith, and Hindustan, India became the major part of the country with a larger population. So the first thing I would do to diffuse your question, never judge a philosophy by its abuse. Never judge a philosophy by its abuse. If a philosophy is abused and therefore pejoratively represented, that's not a legitimate argument. I can make any philosopher seem really mindless and stupid if I take his philosophy or her philosophy and make it something that it was not. And so if the Christian faith is taken and represented to be the way it is by this kind of an assumption, what they are really saying is they have made a judgment upon Jesus Christ by seeing what some people did in using him for their own advantage. That is wrong hermeneutic. You do not interpret thinking that way. Let me put it in perspective. When Jesus was on earth, women were not even given an authoritative voice in court. Just look at what the Lord did. A woman with the alabaster ointment came and washed his feet and wiped it with her tears. He paid her the greatest compliment of anyone. He said, wherever the gospel is preached, there shall also this be told of what this woman has just done to me with her alabaster ointment. He took the woman at the well with 5 broken marriages and made her the first evangelist to the Samaritans, much to the shock of the disciples themselves as he sent her to become the spokesperson. And the greatest truth of all, on which peg hangs the entire Christian faith, is the resurrection. He revealed himself first to the women who would come. They're the ones who went and told those frightened boys what had really happened. They were, we talk about like a mighty army moves the church of God. They were like a bunch of frightened Boy Scouts hiding. And the women went, and the women were looking, and he revealed himself to them. He reverses our paradigms. He reverses our paradigms. Paul Waitman Hoon, in his book, The Integrity of Worship, says, Jesus Christ continually contradicts us in the way we experience ourselves as alive and compels us to radically redefine what we mean by life. He encounters us the way he encountered the disciples on Easter Sunday. They were the ones marked out for death. Those who had survived him were really the dead. He, the dead one, was really the living. That's the reversal of the paradigm. So what I say to you is, if you have that feeling that the Christian faith is what brought all of this about, you do not understand the Christian faith, and it's a sad reality of having represented the Lord that way. In fact, the Christian faith commands me to love my brother, to love my sister, that we are all created in the image of God, and no one is superior to the other. We are all servants one to another. We have come here to serve. So those who have been wronged, God wants you to know what has happened is not right. Those who said that the gospel gave them the right to do wrong things, not so. But then there's another side to it. The logic of unforgiveness will change, will continue the myth for generations to come. The Bible talks of reconciliation. The first thing we need to do is find reconciliation, because we ourselves have been reconciled to God. We don't deserve his forgiveness, but he pursued us with an everlasting love. If we can sit around a table and honestly let the past be the past, but find the way forward with the truth of the gospel of who each one is, and find the best possible means with minimum loss of the next generation to the same thing, then we can find rescue. Otherwise, the best part of us is underground, and you don't want that. Jesus looked at those who despised him and said, Father, forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing. And a lot of what has happened, people had no idea what they were really doing. So I say to you, outside of the gospel, there is no hope in this situation. And outside of the willingness to reconcile, there will be no future for the next generation. So the gospel and reconciliation, which are interwoven, only in the scriptures is there an answer. There isn't an answer in any one of these other faiths, no matter how you look at it. That's my answer to you.
Evening, Ravi.
Evening.
My question is, you seem to say that morality is like this proof of Christianity that God exists or something. My question is, you keep saying that a moral law requires a moral lawgiver. But how do you make that jump? Can't a moral law exist without someone? Couldn't it have developed by evolution or?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Very, very good question. Thank you for asking that. He's quoting me from a conversation I had with a gentleman in Nottingham years ago when he raised the problem of evil. And I looked at him and I said, when you say there's such a thing as evil, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as good? When you say there's good, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as a moral law by which to differentiate between good and evil? And if you say there's such a thing as a moral law, you must posit a moral lawgiver. I said, but that's whom you're trying to disprove and not prove. So he looked at me and said, what then am I asking you? I said, I'll tell you. And here's my answer to you. It's not as difficult as you may think. Every question of moral reasoning is either raised by a person or about a person. Either by a person as you're raising it or about a person, which means you're assuming intrinsic worth in personhood. Evolution cannot have that luxury. So there's your answer. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My question, I guess, leads off from the previous guy's question. The sin of Adam and Eve, or the sins of Adam and Eve, explain a lot of the pain and suffering that we see in the world today. But there's other realities, such as natural disasters that wipe out communities, freak accidents, babies born with disabilities, people born with both male and female parts. And how do we link these realities with the original sin? If a mother had a disabled child, it seems almost unsympathetic to say, well, many, many years ago, somebody disobeyed God, and now we have to just deal with this.
Yeah, I think if that's the way you say it, it would be very unsympathetic. There's no doubt about it. There's no doubt about it. But I think your point is well made. I understand where you're coming from. You're not just talking about the reality of personal evil. You're talking about natural disasters and the evil that comes from the elements and so on and so forth. This kind of question has enormous scope for answers. If I were to take 3 or 4, could have created a world where you would only choose good, or God could have created this kind of world where there's a possibility of good and evil with the freedom to choose. This is the only possibility of the 4 where love is possible. Love is not possible in any of the other paradigms that I've given to you. So if love is the greatest ethic and freedom is the greatest gift, the fact of the matter is wherever love is given as a possibility, pain is a real possibility as well. When you love somebody, you have no guarantee that this will be a pain-free love, but you still love. When a mother has a child, there's no guarantee that everything the child will do will be much delight to her eyes, but the person still has the child. So all I can say to you is that in the representation of Adam and Eve in the story, what Adam and Eve did is what exactly you and I would have done. What was the temptation? The temptation was not so much to not eat the fruit of the tree. The temptation was not to play God. In the day you do of this, you shall be as God, knowing good and evil. So the temptation really was don't play God. And in playing God, we end up with a world where each one of us tries to play God. And where evil comes by the freedom to reject the love of God, the only possibility later remains, through love, that God gives you and me the reality of conquering, not in spite of the dark mystery of evil, but conquering through it. Not conquering in spite of the dark mystery of evil, but conquering through it. You know, if a mother takes a little child to the doctor, and the doctor is going to jab that injection in the arm, that child is going to be totally mystified. What on earth is she doing? Not only is she watching while he jabs my arm, but then she opens her purse and pays him for it. And the day comes where disease strikes, and that child is spared that disease. So I will just say to you that He will set your feet like the feet of a deer, says Habakkuk, who moved from fear to faith. He says, though there are no cattle in the pens or sheep in the stalls, I will rejoice in God my Savior, for the sovereign Lord is my strength. He sets my feet like the feet of a deer. He lifts you above the horizontal to get the vertical perspective. And it's not as simple as the way you just dismissively give a statement to a hurting mother. You actually find a way to bring comfort and love and show the love of God in that kind of a situation. I've often quoted this hymn of Annie Johnston Flint, who was with rheumatoid arthritis, cancerous, blind, orphaned, spent most of her years cradled in cushions, pillows, and she said, He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labors increase. To added affliction He addeth His mercy. To multiplied trials His multiplied peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed as the days have done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving has only begun. His love has no limit. His grace has no measure. His power has no boundaries known unto men. For out of His infinite riches in Jesus, He giveth and giveth and giveth again. He gives you strength as you endure the suffering because you understand the source of all goodness. And we as a church are called to reach out to those who are hurting and suffering and show them the love of God and give them that embrace that God wants us to give. That would be my response to you in a few moments here.
Good evening. My question is as follows. Out of 3,000 religions that are out there, why Christianity is the correct one? And if so, where was it before the early civilizations, before Mesopotamia, Egypt? Where was it then?
Okay, so you've really got two questions.
Sorry.
Okay, yeah. Let me take the first one first. There are really not 3,000 religions in the world. They are summarized in a handful of them, believe it or not. In Hinduism, there are 330 million deities in Hinduism alone. You can actually have your own God and make that choice. There are really a handful of religions, sir, very few, that really are doctrinaire in nature. For example, you've got the monotheistic religions in Judaism, Christianity, Islam. You've got the pantheistic religions in Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism. They're also not all the same because Hinduism has both a monistic first part of it where they don't talk so much about God, but the second one is the bhakti, the devotional aspect, theism. Buddhism is functionally atheistic. It's an ethical theory. So these are the major ones that have doctrines and teachings and so on. The reason I believe the Christian faith is the only true faith is all of them can't be right. They can all be wrong. They can't all be right unless we're lunatics trying to settle what is contradictory to each other. There's basically one pursuit, and that's truth. We need to know the truth. But then you move into the second category. There are two ways in which truth is actually tested: correspondence and coherence. Particular statements have to correspond to reality. All of the arguments put together have to cohere. So we've got 1 and 2. Now we've got 3 in the making here. When you talk to a philosopher, he says there has to be logical consistency, empirical adequacy, experiential relevance. Truth, correspondence, coherence, logical consistency, empirical adequacy, experiential relevance. You've got 1 to 3. Now you've got 4. What are the questions? Origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Okay. Now you've got 5, and I'll end with that. It actually takes 5 distinctive disciplines to truly scrutinize these 4 areas, from philosophy and theology and science and anthropology and archaeology, which is why you're really raising the question. Take all these disciplines and how do you arrive at this? When you take the answers of Jesus, he is the only one, I believe, who meets these first 3 tests: to get to the truth, to meet correspondence and coherence, and then to be able to answer the 4 questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny, but to do it with logical consistency, empirical adequacy, and experiential relevance. See, the Bible is just not a book about theology, about your life and mine, where we find the answers. Your question is so critical for us to understand, really. It's at the base of all other questions. The Bible is a book of geography. The Bible is a book of history. The Bible is a book of a narrative, and it has taken 66 books with 40 authors over 1,500 years, all of them pointing to the same. Abraham came from the Near East, and he looked for a city whose builder and maker was God. God, the Bible says, who in diverse manners and at sundry times has spoken to us through the prophets, and these last days has spoken to us through the Son. You go back even to the ancient Hindu scriptures. If you go to Calcutta today, to the temple of Kali, you will see sacrifice being offered. It's one of 2 centers in India where sacrifice is offered. I dare you to ask the priest, why are you doing this? He doesn't really give you the answer. But the man comes with a white kurta pajama, brings the goat, anchors it there, chop of the blade, he bends down, touches the blood, puts a mark on his shirt, and he goes away. The covering of blood has been a historic reality for centuries, even before the coming of Christ. And I'll close with one simple illustration. And we have authored a couple of books on this. One I've called Jesus Among Other Gods, and with my colleague Vince Vitale, Jesus Among Secular Gods. I urge you to get it, and if you know what, if you'll see my friend, my colleagues there, give them a mailing address, we'll mail it to you with our compliments. But the closing, what I was going to do was this. Some years ago, some terrorists came into Mumbai, 2 hotels basically, blew open a lot of lives, just killed them. I was there shortly after that, staying in one of those very hotels. And an Indian actor who was actually English-born was being interviewed on television. He had an amazing story. He said, I was there. I was in the Taj Mahal Hotel. I was in the dining room. I was having dinner with my friends. All of them were slaughtered. We all ducked for cover. And as I was there with the huddle beneath the table, all of my friends were dead. And I heard footsteps. I knew it was the killer. He came right beside me and stared at this pile of bodies. And I cannot figure out why he never pulled the trigger. And the interviewer said, have you any thoughts on it? He said, there's only one thought. Seeing me covered by the blood of others, he took me for dead and moved on. The reality of a blood covering goes back through ancient religions for centuries. The Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world, the Lamb without spot or blemish. He is the truth and takes the 4 questions and answers them with correspondence and coherence. That is my brief answer to you. Thank you, sir. One more.
Hello, sir.
How are you? Could you lift the microphone up a little bit, then I'll make sure to hear you. And I guess we'll make this the last one. Is that right? We've got to rush to the airport. Yeah,
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'm in Christian media, and I have to explain to young people and other people. In South Africa at the moment, there's this tense atmosphere where we are starting to be disillusioned with what happened in 1994, where between the races. And what I struggle to reconcile is the fact that when we look at the world at the moment, where people of my color have been most oppressed, and this could be wrong, but in America, for instance, if you take the most Christian parts of America where they say it's conservative, those places is where you see, and historically, you see people, for instance, being lynched because of the color of their skin. And these are the people who hold dearly the Christian values. And if you look at, the gentleman mentioned countries like the West, countries like, yeah, okay. So what I want to know is, people look at this and saying, okay, that's where the gospel had the most impact. That's where people call themselves Christians. But that is where the people with the color of my skin have been most oppressed. Lynching, and South Africa, when it called itself a Christian country, that is when it oppressed people the color of my skin. So I want to be able to explain to young people, how is this possible with the impact of the gospel in those areas, in those peoples that oppressed people who look like me?
Thank you. You know what? I'm going to say something that I might regret I'm going to say. This is such a profound question and so important in a culture such as this, at a time such as this. I don't know whether we presume to have the answers, but I will commit to coming along with my colleagues and having a dialogue and a gathering with people like you who are raising this question so that we can do justice in some way to respond to it. I will commit to that. Okay, that's the first thing. Secondly, sometimes we get a very narrow view, if you don't mind my saying so, because of the way the media presents it too. I have had interviews sometimes with the media, and I walk away from that, and when I see the report in the press, I said nothing like what they've represented me to say. People generally want to get to an end game, and they will use, you know it well, the game can be played. I come from India. India is not the West. India was bathed in the Vedas and the Gita and so on. There's a lot of discrimination in India, a lot of it. The entire caste system was what Mahatma Gandhi was trying to fight as well. If you take the case of the entire Nazi movement, or the rebellion in China, or in Russia, these were non-religious, non-Christian movements. They slaughtered millions of people with having nothing to do with the gospel. So in some ways, when the gospel takes a hit, they're not really seeing what atheism has done. Atheism slaughtered tens of millions more through the purges in Russia, through the purges in China. And the only difference is those who did it in the name of Christ were illogically connecting it to the gospel. Those who did it as atheists were logically connecting it to playing God. So we have to make that difference. What I believe, as you have represented, that in the South, I live in the South. I watch what happens in the South. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. A lot of Southerners who live in so-called Bible Belt, you ask them to really give a systematic presentation of the gospel and theology, they have no idea what you're talking about. It was a cultural mix that swept them along. It is not a studied reaction to who Jesus Christ really is. And so when they say the South was basically Christian, it is only Christian in name. It was not Christian in essence. And so it is not a fair hit to take against them. And in many ways, it's not a fair hit, for example, to say that the Hindu faith did all of this. There were people in the Hindu faith who used it to their own advantage. Always beware of people who leverage an idea for a destructive means. You cannot take a noble belief and use an ignoble means to an even less noble end. That ultimately trivializes what you call noble as your belief. If you take a noble belief and use ignoble means to an even less noble end, the belief is not noble. It is just a caricature and a configuration of it. I think God has positioned you in a very unique place to be a peace builder. And if you will diffuse the errors that people make, all you need to ask them is, when you say that the South is Christian, what do you mean by that? What does it take to be a Christian? Just to say I am a Christian? Not so. It has to be a follower of Jesus Christ who loves